So, where were we? We're up to Siman Pei Test. I want to finish Siman Pei Test today. We're skipping Siman Tzadi. Most yeshivas, they skip Siman Tzadi because it has to do with udders, a kechol, an udder of a cow, how to kasher it. It's very impractical, and a lot of yeshivas I know skip it, so I feel comfortable skipping it as well. So we're going to go on to Siman Tzadi Aleph next week. My intention is maybe do a part of the Chazara today, maybe the whole Chazara next time with the Bechinas, with the next test on Pei Ches and Pei Test next week. So today I just want to finish up, just want to put the dots the I's and cross the T's. The last thing we did was we did most of Siman Pei Test Sif Gimel, but there's one line at the end of the Mechaber we ran out of time. So I'll maybe just quickly read the Mechaber again, but the really Iker is the last line, and it's a standalone line. The Mechaber had said, Ochel Tavshil Shel Basar, if a person eats a dish that's not eating the meat of the dish, but it's a dish that's cooked with meat, Mutter Lechel Acher of Tavshil Shel Gvina, you don't have to wait 6 hours. So if you have chicken soup, the Mechaber holds you don't have to wait 6 hours. As I mentioned last time, we don't paskin this way, even Svardim don't paskin this way. Vanatila b'nei me'enel reshus, the obligation to wash your hands is only reshus, it's not even obligatory. Then the Mechaber continues, the Ramah says, V'yesh matzrichim netila, then the Ramah says, no, you have to wash your hands, but again, there's no need to wait 6 hours in between, which obviously we don't paskin like. Again, this is all we did last time, I'm not... So, the Mechaber then says, let's skip a few lines. Let's get to what, I'll read it. The Ramah says the minig is to wait 6 hours after a tafshil shel basar, after chicken soup, even though you're not actually eating the chicken, you still have to wait 6 hours, that's the minig. Miu. Imein basar b'tavshil, however, if there's no meat in the dish, you're just using meat equipment, Rashas basham k'dei shel basar, mutalech lachmer gvina, you don't have to wait 6 hours. This is all we did last time. Ein boy minig lahachmer. Fine. Okay, that was probably unnecessary. Now we're going to get up to the point that the Mechaber ends off the halacha in the following way. The Mechaber says, and when you read it, it's a strange thing. It's one of those that's instantly strange. We've been talking till now that if you, let's say you go from meat and you go from dairy and you want to go to meat. So what were the 3 things you had to do? So you had to eat something, you had to rinse your mouth out, and you had to make sure your hands are clean. So you have to wash your hands, or look at your fingers. You have to, so we said, and if there's a fork, and all, v'chule. The Mechaber says the following line, Shamish hamashamish besuda. If you're the waiter, v'negei boichlin, and you're serving, you're not eating, but you're making the plates. Ein etzarech netila. You don't have to wash your hands between touching the meat plates and the milk plates. Because the only ones that have to wash their hands are the ones that are eating, not the ones that are serving. Now, that's a very strange halacha, because if the point of washing your hands after eating dairy before meat, back then when they used to use their fingers, but like I said, forget about the forks and knives. They used to use their fingers. So if you eat milk and you want to go to meat, you have to wash your hands because your hands are full of schmutz. Says the Mechaber, a waiter doesn't have to do this. It's a pella. It's a strange thing. Why would a waiter? What's the difference? The takana was only for those that are eating, not for waiters. It doesn't make any sense. So the truth is, the Shach is bothered by this kasha. So if you look at the Shach in Sivkat and Chaf Aleph, this teaching of the Mechaber, Kein Kasav Gam HaBeis Yosef. The Shach writes, this teaching is from the Beis Yosef, B'Shem Rashi. Ube'emes, Loi Diktikul Klal. The truth is, the whole thing's a mistake. It's not a halacha that's accurate, it's a mistake. The Rashi, Loi Ayri Hasam El Inyan Netilas Yadayim Harishonim. Lachila. The Rashi was referring to when this concept, this halacha, that waiters don't have to wash their hands, it's being misunderstood. It was not referring to going from meat to milk or milk to meat. That's not what the Rashi was referring to. Rashi was referring to, do you have to wash your hands when you're handling bread? Netil sidayim. Netil sidayim rishonim. And the halacha is, there's only a takanim, netil sidayim, for those that are eating. Meaning, don't think that merely making the sandwiches, you have to wash your hands. You only have to wash your hands if you eat bread. It has no shaykhis to these halachas. These halachas, of course the waiter would have to wash his hands. Why would the waiter not have to wash his hands? Says the Shach, Hu pashit b'shas, umuskim b'chol ha'paiskim, k'moishin esbar b'Orach Chaim. It's a halach in Orach Chaim. Le'ein ha'machil tzarech netilas yadayim, af pi shenegeya. That if you're serving someone bread, you don't have to wash your hands. Okay, I don't know, maybe I would think that the waiter would have to wash his hands. No, Kamash one, he doesn't have to. But it's not referring to these halachas at all. The Beis Yosef, again, he's saying it was a mistake that it was applied to these halachas. It's not true. Says the Shach, but these halachas of washing our hands from milk and meat, where you're worried about schmutz, that there's a schmutz on your hand, what's the difference between the waiter and the non-waiter? What's the nafkamina? If you're eating, you have to wash your hands because your hands are schmutzy, and then the milk is gonna get on the meat and vice versa. But the waiter doesn't have to. It doesn't make any sense. And no one says this other than this Shulchan Aruch, and therefore says the Shach, I disagree. And I think that most poskim would follow the Shach. It's very, very difficult to understand this Beis Yosef. Okay, new halacha. Just to finish up, this Mechaber Shulchan Aruch Sif Dalid. The Mechaber says as follows. There's a couple halachas, one of them super, super practical. The Mechaber begins off like this. Mi sha'achal gvina. If a person eats dairy, v'roitzel echel basar, and you now want to eat meat, so we talked about last time, you have to wash your hands, you have to eat something, you have to rinse your mouth out, that's it. What is there anything else you have to do? Says the Mechaber, tzarich leva'er mi'ala shulchan, you have to burn, you have to get rid of on the table, shiur pas, the little pieces of bread, sha'achlu magvina, meaning if you have bread that was, again, I'll go to the most extreme case. Let's go opposite. You're making, you're going to meat to milk. Forget about it. It's just easier in my head because I know there's time, but forget about time. You're making cold cuts. You're making deli sandwiches, and you have pieces of bread, and everyone's grabbing the bread, and they're making deli sandwiches, and you finish the meal, and there's 2 or 3 pieces left. The halacha is those pieces may not be used for a dairy meal. You cannot use those pieces to be turned into French toast. Why? Very simple. There might be schmutz of meat on the pieces of bread. So the Mechaber is saying the opposite is also true. If you're having a dairy meal, you're making cheese sandwiches, and you have bread, and there's a couple pieces of bread left over, you are not allowed to use that bread for meat. Now, there's an obvious question, not an obvious question, but a question I get asked a lot, and that is, does it make a difference if it's a slice of bread? What if it's a half a loaf? What if it's a full loaf? Often on Shabbos, this is very relevant on Shabbos. The challah, you have extra challah after the meal, and you want to save it for Sunday morning to make French toast, to make grilled cheese. Are you able to? So the Mechaber says very clearly it's a problem. So the question is there a distinction? What exactly is the Mechaber referring to? Is he referring to small pieces? Is he referring to half a loaf? Does that mean that you just can't bring it to the table? I'll give you, listen, if you were to have pieces of challah from Shabbos, and you take them off the table before the meat course, there's no shiloh. Of course, they weren't on the table at the same time. But the classic case is you have challah in the middle of the table, it's sliced up, meal ends, there's a couple pieces left over, you don't want to throw them out. Sfardim are very makbid, right? Halachically you're not supposed to either, but Sfardim are super makbid, even the crumbs, they don't do it. So you want to save them, and then you want to use it for Sunday. Is it a problem? Mechaber says it's an issue. So let's just read a very short tshuva from Moshe Feinstein together. This is the entire tshuva, Kemat. I cut out a couple lines, but this is a tshuva from Moshe. Igris Moshe Yeridei Siman Lamed Ches. We'll read it together. The Mechaber says like this. Ubedavar misha oichel gvina. So Moshe says, the fact that if you eat cheese, v'roitzel echel basar, and then you want to eat eat meat, so you have cheese and bread, cheese and meat, you're eating cheese, and then you want to eat meat, She'isa b'yaredeya, the Mechaber paskins, she'tzarich leva'er shiure pas she'achlu makvina, that the Mechaber says you cannot use the same bread for both, you have to get rid of the bread. Shehikshe yedidi, whoever the person who wrote the letter to Moshe asked the following question: Mashma she'tzarich liyachid pas lemachali basar levad ulemachali cholav levad. It would seem that from this Mechaber you are not allowed to have the challah from Shabbos to be used for dairy. If it's for a meat meal, it can't be used for a dairy meal. That seems to be what the Mechaber is saying. So says Rav Moshe, V'lama ein harim b'zeh. Rav Moshe was asked, why is nobody makbid about this? People will bag up the challah after the Shabbos meal and then use it for grilled cheese. Why is no one particular with a clear teaching of the Shulchan Aruch? So says Rav Moshe the following. Hinehu iser, Rav Moshe says like this. This is the rule. Ha-iser, the actual iser, hu rak al shiure chatichas hapas, she'achlu ba hagvina. First of all, the classic problem is the bread that you actually had the meat on the bread. Meaning, in other words, you have a deli sandwich and then you peel the deli off. That bread, that's for sure a problem. Now that's beyond obvious. No one in our right mind would take the bread, remove the the deli and then put cheese on it. Says Ramosha, or he says, or let's say it's bread that you sliced in order to eat deli. Now the halacha is, even though you didn't actually put deli on it, but it was sliced for that purpose on the table with the deli. Now why is that significant? I didn't put deli on it. Ramosha says the following: Shalzu eina nizer. People are not particular. Kivan shechoshav locha magvina. There's a rule throughout halacha, and that is, you're not neman to say that you were particular about something that nobody's particular about. If it's something that is just insignificant, it's an insignificant act. We don't trust you to say, I didn't do it. Nobody, it's milsa de loy ramya aleha. Something that just people aren't really focused on, we just assume. So Ramosha says, if you slice bread, I'm using the meat to dairy because to me it's just an easier permutation, but it's true the opposite as well. If you slice bread on the table to eat with deli, and people are taking with their hands the deli and the bread, we don't trust that slice you didn't touch. Because your hands are full of deli, nobody's really thinking, it's throughout the meal, that's the problem. So Ramosha is telling us the isser of the machaber, the actual isser, is bread that you actually put the deli on, or bread that was sliced on the table with the intention to eat as a deli sandwich, and we don't trust that I didn't touch. In my family, we don't touch the bread. Nobody is, even if your family is taka OCD to that madrega, we don't trust you because that's not normal. So says Ramosha, Avol pas hagadola, but let's say you didn't slice up a little pieces. You had a half a loaf left over, which is the classic case. You have mamish like a half a challah that's sitting on the table. You say, what's the concern? I didn't cut it for that. It was on the table at the same time as the meat, but it wasn't cut. What's the concern here? So says Ramosha, that the mechaber was not addressing. So says Ramosha, avla pas hagadola, but a large slice of challah, shehi omedes bein lamachale chalav bein lamachale basar, that's sitting at the table, both at a meat meal and a dairy meal, but it was not sliced for the purpose of cheese or for the purpose of meat. It just happens to be at the table. It's a large chunk of challah. Says Ramosha is harimba. People are particular that you make sure it's not shmutzi. Ve'ein lachush shema nogu v'hagvina basar. That's technically mutter. Now stop right here. You say, well, according to Ramosha, it's not okay. Then 90% of the time, it's okay. Ramosha throws a little bit of a curveball at the end. Misha roitza lahachmer shaloi la'echol kol hapas shahaya la'shulchan shamachal gvina im basar or lehepoch. But let's say a person says, I want to be machmer, not to use it at all. If it was on the table during a meat meal, I will not use it for dairy and vice versa. Ramosha says, Af she'im bazech shash medina, even though it's not necessary al pi halacha, but you'd like to be machmer, yesh bezeh maila. It's a good thing. It's a maila. It's a choshev ezach to be strict. Laharchaka. And so Ramosha says, I'll prove it to you. So Ramosha is being mechadish that there's two halachas. There's the halacha of the Shulchan Aruch, which is an isser. That is only for bread that was sliced with the intention to eat deli, or bread that was sliced with the intention to eat cheese. But a large hunk of challah, that's technically mutter. But Ramosha says, if you want to be strict, it's a nice thing. It's a maila and it's a harchaka. I'll prove it to you, says Ramosha. Why? Because he says, Zeu kavanas hagoyis ashri. In the back of the Gemara, there's the Rosh, and then by the Rosh, there's little comments in the middle. It's by one of the Rishonim. It's called Hagoyis Ashri. To this day, I'll never forget, when I was in yeshiva, only until I was like in 11th grade, then they stopped it. The end of the Zman and the end of the year, you would have a test on everything you learned over the last 6 months, and it was a faher, 1-on-2, by the two Rosh Hashivas. You walked in, it was Rosh Shalom Rav Kalman sitting behind the desk, and they would test you. I, to this day, can remember that fear. I get scared a lot. But that was a different kind of fear. But it felt so good when you were done. And I remember, mamish, it pachad v'nor, kipshuta. I remember walking in, and they asked me a shaila, and I said the Haggais Ashri says, and I'll never forget, Rav Shalom said, I was in 9th grade, he said, where's the Haggais Ashri? I said, it's by the back of the Gemara, by the Rosh. He said, okay. I was like, thank God. And therefore, I will never forget where the Haggais Ashri is. I just always remember. So Haggais Ashri is one of the Rishonim in the back of the commentary in the Rosh. So the Haggais Ashri quotes this halacha, but look how Ramosha says how the Haggais Ashri says it. The Haggais Ashri says, in Parakal Basar, Siman Zayin, mitzvah min hamuvchar, heichel da'achal gevina, v'roitz achal basar, sarach lahav ma'al chashulchan ayin sham. He quotes this halacha and he says, mitzvah min hamuvchar. So it says Ramosha, I don't understand, was that mitzvah min hamuvchar? I thought it's aser. Says Ramosha, must be there's two different types. There's the Isser, and that's what the Shulchan Aruch is referring to, and then there's Mitzvah min HaMovcher. Mitzvah min HaMovcher means you don't use that at all if it's on the table. So it says Ramosha, Kavanose af lepasa gedola. What the Geis HaShiur is referring to, it's a tremendous, brilliant insight from Ramosha. That's what Ramosha means. That's the Geis HaShiur says it's Mitzvah min HaMovcher. Because if it's just referring to the case of the Mechaber, where I slice bread with the intention to eat for a deli sandwich, very specific, or for grilled cheese, Eina Medina Yerushalmi, to Shamu din Mamish. That's in Isser. So what do you say? Mitzvah min HaMovcher. Eich kosav shurak la mitzvah min HaMovcher. Avusfaras atzmai. So it says Ramosha, the Geis HaShiur is referring to this. It's a chiddush that Geis HaShiur is saying. Even if you have a large hunk of challah, it's technically mutter, but mitzvah min HaMovcher to not do this. So that's why when people ask me, I always say the same thing. If it's a large hunk of challah, it's technically mutter. But it's a mitzvah min HaMovcher to be machmer. So if you want to be machmer, it's a nice thing. That's what I say. If you want to be machmer, it's a nice thing. But you always have to take things into account. Because if it's the only challah you have, and that's what the kids want from, they want to have a grilled cheese, I wouldn't be so crazy. But it's a mitzvah min HaMovcher. Okay. That's why if you want to avoid the shiloh, you take the challah off the table before the fleishik, and vice versa. Okay. Back to the Mechaber. So the Mechaber again says in Sif Dalid, Misha achal gvina v'roitz lechel basar. If you ate cheese and then you want to eat meat, tzarich lahaver ma'al shulchan shiurei pasha achal magvina. You have to remove from the table all the slices of bread. And again, according to Ramosha, this is referring to slices of bread that were actually used for dairy or were intended to use for dairy because your hands are schmutzy and they probably touched it. New halacha. Aser le'echel gvina al mapa she'achlu ba basar. You're not allowed to eat meat and dairy on the same surface. Meaning, this is a placemat. You have a placemat for dairy. You're not allowed to eat meat on the placemat. This is the makar of the concept that the table is one thing, and then you want to eat the other type, you put the placemat. Meaning the table is fleishik, and then when you want to eat milchik, you put a placemat, or vice versa. It's from this mechaber that you're not allowed to eat on one surface both meat and dairy. So you're not allowed to have one placemat for both meat and dairy. Now there's an obvious question. Does that still apply? Because one can argue that this halacha, which is from the Rashba, maybe that was back then when they used to eat on the table. Nowadays we have plates. So is this really necessary? The Mechaber is telling you you're not allowed to have one surface for both meat and dairy. Now, by the way, if the surface is glass, we'll get to this later on. Glass, pashtus is always parav because it can't really become milchik or fleishik. But let's say it's a plastic table. So in yeshiva, there was always that the table was dairy, and then when you so if you're eating dairy, you would pull back the tablecloth, and the tablecloth is meat, yeah?
Didn't we say earlier that the reason you switch tablecloths, you have two different tablecloths, is if you're eating two people at the same table?
This is Stam. This is no other person. This is I ate meat today, and then an hour later, I get rid of the meat, and now I'm eating dairy. I can't eat it on the same surface.
I think the reason why we had to have the separate tablecloth is not because you can't eat meat.
No, the purpose. So that was saying that's a good point. That the Mechaber did mention the concept of having two placemats, but in the past it was to serve as a hecker. Now the Mechaber is saying that they're an added necessity, and that is you can't eat both on the same type of surface. Now, if you look at the Pischei Tshuva in Sivkat and Ches addresses whether this is essential nowadays, because one can argue. I mean, the Mechaber seems to say that when you go home, your kitchen table has to be picked as something. By the way, this is just something we'll get to later on. Later on in the halachas, I think in Siman Tzadi Beis, we'll talk about ovens. Ovens have to be something. And then if you use it for the other, there are ways to do it. I've spoken to someone once where they're like, I said, well, what's your oven? They say, well, it's both. Well, that's a problem. The oven has to be either milchik or fleishik, and then when you're cooking in it, you either kasher or cover. You have to be koveya it as something. So the Mechaber is saying the same thing with tables. The table has to be nikva, that this is a dairy table or a fleishik table. So it says the Pischei Tshuva, Ayin Mashakasav Redvaz. The Redvaz references this halacha. Now the Redvaz was a contemporary of the Beis Yosef, so he's referencing the source of this, which is the Rashba. Ein divrei harav ela kashayu manichan habasar agvina al hamapa. This was back then when they used to eat on the table. They used to just pour the food on the table. So if they're pouring the food on the table, don't think you could say, I'll clean it in between. No. You can't eat on the surface the same thing milk and the same thing meat. That's what the Shulchan Aruch is really referring to. But says the Radvaz, nowadays we use plates. So what's the concern here? That maybe something will fall off the plate, and it's such a small concern. Hilka chafilu lotzei sidi chumras harashba behibach hamapel luchud basar sapatin sagi b'chein nagu. So he says the truth is it's not maker adin. You want to be machmer? So just flip it over, okay? The point is, the Radvaz is sort of throwing a wrench. He's saying that this requirement is not as strong. The minig is still to have a separation, but it's not as necessary as what's used to be. Back to the Mechaber. The Mechaber says, Shiur, Asur lachal gvina al mapa shalchu babasa v'chein lehepach asur v'chein masher baruch. Kol shekin she'asur lachtich gvina afilu tzainenes b'sakin sh'regilin lachtich basar. You're not allowed to take a dairy knife that was used to cut cheese and then to cut meat with it. Okay, pretty simple, pretty obvious. Do not use a milk knife to cut meat, even if everything's cold. The reason being is because in the times of the Shulchan Aruch, and even nowadays, in the times of Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber was very concerned that it is very hard to clean knives. They have so many grooves, they have so much surface level, it's hard to clean it. So if you have a knife that was used to cut dairy, to cut cheese, you can't cut meat with it, even if everything's cold, because you say, I'll clean it. No, we don't trust you. Now, lichachila it's aser. Now the Mechaber addresses it. Yeah? What is that? True, serrated is definitely worse. It seems to be that they're machmer even regular because of the area where the knife touches the handle. It's hard to clean. It's just hard to get it clean. So you're not allowed to, says the Mechaber. V'loy oid. Not only are you not allowed to use the dairy knife to cut meat, you're not allowed to use the dairy knife to cut bread that you're going to eat with the burger. Again, the same problem. The schmutz on top. So I take a dairy knife that has cheese residue on the knife. Not only am I not allowed to cut meat, I'm not allowed to cut the bread to have a burger. Same concern. Now, but if you stab the ground, it's mutter. This is where there's a famous thing, I'll just say this very quickly, there are misconceptions. There are the famous misconceptions that there's a concept that it's already gotten into like the Goyish world as well, but I had someone from Hashivenu called me up, and he said that, it's about tshuva, and he said that he had just got married, and his wife's family was very, very frum, and he says, it sounds like a joke, but he said there were spoons in the flower pot, and he didn't understand what that was. So I said, it's nothing. It's mamsh nothing. What people do is they think that taking non-kosher keilim and putting it in soil does something, and avada does nothing. When a kli is non-kosher, it needs to be purged. It's only be able to be purged with heat. So putting it in a flower pot is shtuyot. But where it comes from is this halacha, and that is that if you have a knife that is technically schmutz, it's covered with schmutz, and I want to use it for cold, what's the problem? The problem is the schmutz on the knife is going to get on the bread or going to get on the meat. So if I stab it in hard ground, not a flower pot, it has to be hard ground, and you stab it 10 times, that will clean the surface of the knife. So then you're allowed to do it. Now what are you allowed to do? Says the Mechaber, Aydeniitza bekarka kasha shari. Now what is permitted when you stab the ground? So if you look at the Taz writes in Sifkat and Vav, Zekoya mashakasav sheroitza lachle kavina besakin shal basar. It's a tremendous chiddush from the Taz. I don't think any of us would do this. The Taz says the stabbing is needed if you want to use a dairy knife to cut meat. So I have a cheese knife and I want to cut a cold salami. So the problem is the schmutz on top. So stabbing on the ground helps. What about if I just want to cut bread to make a burger? So I have a cheese knife. If I want to eat cut a salami, I need to stab the ground. But if I don't want to cut a salami, I just want to cut bread to eat a burger, says the Taz, says the Taz, that you don't even have to do much. If you want to eat bread with a burger and you want to cut it with a cheese knife, you just need to scrub it with a napkin. Stabbing on the ground is needed for a high level kashrus, and that's to actually eat basar. So very simple. According to the Taz, if you have a cheese knife and you want to actually cut salami, you could do that if you stab the ground. If you look at the Shach says, no way. The Shach writes, in Sifkat and Chavbeis, Masha dimnotzu bekarka kasha muta lachachila lachtuch bypass. Says the Shach, no. Stabbing in the ground will only allow you to cut bread with the other type. No way you're allowed to take a cheese knife and cut a salami, even with stabbing in the ground. So there's a machlokes, is there ever a time where I could take a cheese knife and cut meat with it? The Taz would say yes if you went through the process of Ne'itza B'karka, and the Shach would say absolutely not. Okay. The Kitzur though, so you have this concept back to the Mechaber, and we'll just finish up soon. The Mechaber writes, again, Ayidei Ne'itza B'karka Kasha Shari. So you have a dairy knife, you're not allowed to cut meat, you're not allowed to cut bread to use with meat. But if you stab it in the ground, it's allowed. Now if you'd stop here, that would mean that we all can have one set of knives for dairy, and if you ever want to cut a bread to make a burger, or according to the Taz, cut a cold salami, you just have to stab it in the ground. Easy, simple solution. Says the Ramah, Avol Kfar Nogu Kol Yisrael. The Ramah writes, but the minig of Klal Yisrael liyas lahem shnei sakinim. The minig of Klal Yisrael is to have two separate types of knives, v'lirsham echa mehem sheheker, and to make a sign on the knife that it's clear, one is for dairy, one is for meat. V'nogu lirsham shecholov. And the minig, apparently, the times of the Ramah, is they only marked the dairy knife, and the meat knife was just standard. Ve'ein l'shanes minig shel Yisrael, and that is the minig of Klal Yisrael. So we do not rely on stabbing in the ground. We don't do this. We have two separate knives, milchik and fleshik. I'll point out two things. If you're going to have pariv food, you need 3 sets of knives. This is something I've learned from experience, that sometimes I'll go to someone, I'll talk to someone, and they'll say, we have meat and dairy, and then we have pariv. My mother she has a lot of times, it's a pariv salad, it's a pariv, hummus is pariv. The only way you could actually have pariv is if you have a pariv knife and a pariv saute pan and a pariv blender. Because if you have pariv, but you don't have a pariv knife, then you probably have treif. Because the knife is either milchik or fleshik. When you cut an onion with a milchik knife, that onion becomes milchik. If you then use it to make matbucha, that is dairy matbucha. If you use the knife with a fleshik knife to cut an onion, that is meat matbucha. There's no such thing as a pariv soup or a pariv salad or dips if you don't have a pariv knife. If you just have dairy and meat, there's no option to have pariv if you're dealing with onions or garlic. And every soup has onions, so it's you have to have a separate dish. Also, one more thing I'll mention, and maybe we'll save the chazara for next week. I'll mention this halacha just because some of the modern day poskim put it over here. It's really related in the Hilchas Pesach. It's from the Magen Avram. I was going to get Marmakaimis. I didn't have time yesterday to try to find the Marmakaimis, but it's in Tov Kuf Aleph in the Magen Avram in Hilchas Pesach. That the Magen Avram writes like this: "It's a minig. Sfardim don't have this problem. We have a minig. It's not a problem. It's a minig. We have a minig amongst Ashkenazim. We do not kasher from dairy to meat, and vice versa. There is no technical issue. If I have a spoon, I have one spoon in my house. It's a meat spoon, and I want to use it for dairy. I kasher it. What's the problem? Technically, I'll constantly be boiling water and dipping it in. Sfardim have no problem with this. Fine. That's what you do. That's fine." The Magen Avram was mechadish. The reason why they pointed is because the Ramah writes the minig of Klal Yisrael 2 sets of dishes, milk and meats. The place can point to that Magen Avram. The Magen Avram writes there's an old minig of Ashkenazim. We do not do this. We do not go from meat to milk or milk to meat. We don't do this. Why? It's very simple. In order to kasher it, you have to do it properly. You have to wait 24 hours, etc. What's going to happen? You have one set of dishes that you always go, not dishes, you have one set of knives. I go from milk to meat and meat to milk. And then what's going to happen one week? You're going to say, you kasher this, right? You say, you kasher this. I said, you kasher this. Now what's going to happen? Bas b'chol. And therefore Ashkenazim said, we don't do this. Now I'll just mention a couple points. Even amongst Ashkenazim, by ovens we do this. Because Rav Moshe Sternbuch in one of his truvas says, then how do you have an oven that you go back and forth, right? Or before Shavuos, you kasher the oven to go from meat to dairy. I thought it's not allowed. So Belsky says, the minig was not niskabel by ovens. Ovens are very expensive and very big. That was never niskabel by the minig. But I'll just mention 2 caveats. The only time it's permitted to go from meat to dairy or dairy to meat is, actually 3 times. One is if it becomes treif. First of all, if it becomes treif. Meaning, if it's basar b'chalav or it's treif, you have to kasher it anyway. So once you're kashering it anyway, you could choose to go, it doesn't have to go back to what it was. I actually heard once that Rav Yaakov used to say that the minig was in Europe is that if it became milchik, they would wait 24 hours and dip it in meat. But that's a very bad idea. That's possible. Okay, so one option is if it's treif. Option number 2 is Erev Pesach. Because Erev Pesach, the minig of Klal Yisrael was to kasher from chametz to Pesach, which is akin to non-kosher to kosher. So because you're kashering it anyway, you can go. So I've told people they have a spoon and they want to go from meat to milk, and it was close to Pesach, I just wait Erev Pesach. You're kashering anyway. Once you're kashering from Chametz to Pesach, then you could just choose to not go to the other one. The third heter is from the Marsham. The Marsham writes in Truvas Marsham that he feels, Rebelsky says the same thing, that the issue is going from milk to meat and meat to milk. But you can go from milk to Parav, or from meat to Parav. And then, after an adequate amount of time of using it as Parav, if you choose to go the other way, that's fine. But you need to use it a little bit. So if you have a milchik spoon, you want to make it Parav, perfectly fine. You want to make it meat, the only way to do it, to avoid breaking this minig lagamri, is you have to make it Parav. And then after a couple weeks, you could then go, you can't just be like, oh, it's technically Parav now. No. You have to use it as Parav. But to go from milk to Parav and meat to Parav, that's perfectly acceptable. No, the 12-month thing, that's a Chuvas Chacham Tzvi. The Chacham Tzvi, it's actually a Shita. The Chacham Tzvi holds that after 12 months, you don't have to kasher anything. Stam. After 12 months, the Ramosha was asked, could you be Samech the Chacham Tzvi when it comes to cheres? Earthenware and porcelain, you can't kasher. So my father had a case once, there was a Baal Shtuva that she had very sentimental chinaware from her grandmother. Her grandmother wasn't religious. So when she became religious, so the rabbi said, you have to get rid of all the china. So it like broke her that she couldn't use her grandmother's china. So my father called Rav Pam, and I think Rav Pam said that because it's very sentimental, and it's been 12 months since it was used, the Chacham Tzvi holds that after 12 months, you don't have to kasher it, because any flavor inside, poof, goes away. Now we don't hold like the Chacham Tzvi, but he said this, and he said if you fill it up with cold water for 72 hours, some sort of eitzah to avoid problems. All right? Sure.